Leah Daniels thought transferring to Greenville Academy would be the fresh start she needed. But on her very first day, it becomes clear that in this elite school, excellence and prejudice go hand in hand. When Leah's sharp intellect and thoughtful contributions in Miss Harding's class are dismissed as disruptive, she quickly realizes that being the daughter of the school's new principal won't shield her from the subtle racism lurking behind polished facades. As tensions rise, Leah's quiet strength is tested to its limits. Ridiculed by peers, silenced by a teacher, and struggling under the weight of her father's expectations, Leah faces a choice: stay silent and endure, or find the courage to stand up and expose the truth. What Leah doesn't know is that her decision will lead to a confrontation that will shake Greenville Academy to its core, and a revelation that no one, least of all Miss Harding, saw coming. In a school where tradition reigns and prejudice festers, one girl's fight for justice will become the spark that ignites a wave of change. But will Leah's strength be enough to take on the system and pave the way for those who come after her? Echoes of Silence is a gripping and emotional story about finding your voice, confronting prejudice, and the quiet defiance that can change everything. Leah Daniels gripped the straps of her backpack as she walked through the gates of Greenville Academy, her father's words echoing in her mind. Just do your best, and everything will fall into place. The towering ivy-covered buildings were intimidating, even more so with the curious glances from students she passed. "Who's she?" a girl whispered to her friend, eyeing Leah's braided hair and uniform. Leah pretended not to hear, her heart thudding in her chest. She had expected this. Being the new girl was never easy, and being the new principal's daughter only added to the pressure. But this was Greenville, one of the best schools in the state. A fresh start, she reminded herself, ignoring the knot tightening in her stomach. As Leah approached the main doors, she spotted a group of girls huddled together. Their eyes flicked toward her, and one of them smirked. Leah hurried past, keeping her gaze low as she made her way to her first class, English with Miss Harding. Miss Harding's classroom felt like stepping into a time capsule. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with classics: Dickens, Austen, Harper Lee. Leah's eyes swept over the students already seated at their desks. Most were chatting casually, but the room fell silent when Miss Harding strode in, her silver-gray hair perfectly styled, her thin-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. "Good morning, class," Miss Harding greeted, her voice crisp. Her eyes flicked to Leah. "Ah, you must be the new student, Leah Daniels, is it?" Leah nodded, standing a little straighter. "Welcome to my class," Miss Harding said, though her tone lacked warmth. "I hope you're prepared for the rigor we maintain here." Leah forced a smile and took a seat near the back. As Miss Harding launched into the day's discussion, To Kill a Mockingbird, Leah felt a flicker of excitement. She loved this book. "Now, let's talk about the themes of morality and justice," Miss Harding began, scanning the room for volunteers. Leah raised her hand eagerly, but Miss Harding's gaze slid past her as if she hadn't seen. "Yes, Marcus," she called on a student in the front row. Leah lowered her hand, the familiar feeling of being overlooked settling in her chest. The class continued, and Leah waited for another opportunity. When Miss Harding mentioned the racial injustice in the trial of Tom Robinson, Leah's hand shot up again. This time, Miss Harding couldn't ignore her. "Yes, Leah?" Miss Harding's voice was clipped. Leah took a deep breath. "I think the way Harper Lee portrays the racial injustice in the courtroom scene reflects how deep systemic racism runs, even in the legal system." Miss Harding cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Systemic racism? I think you're overcomplicating things, Leah. To Kill a Mockingbird is about the broader human condition, not modern political agendas. Let's keep the conversation focused on the text, shall we?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Leah's face burned, but she stayed quiet, her jaw tight. In the corner of her eye, she noticed a boy, Oliver, if she remembered correctly, glancing her way, sympathy in his eyes. Miss Harding moved on without another word to Leah, calling on other students who echoed her narrow interpretation of the book. After class, Leah packed her things slowly, feeling the weight of embarrassment hanging over her. As she slung her backpack over her shoulder and headed for the door, Oliver approached. "Hey, Leah," he said quietly. His curly brown hair fell into his eyes as he looked at her, awkward but sincere. I thought what you said was interesting. About the racism in the courtroom scene, Leah blinked in surprise. Thanks, she murmured, still stung from Miss Harding's dismissal. I don't think she agreed. Oliver shrugged. Miss Harding's, well, she doesn't like straying from her ideas. But what you said made sense. He hesitated. I probably should have said something too. Leah managed a small smile. It's okay. Thanks, though. Oliver nodded, but said nothing more. Leah could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but she wasn't ready to draw anyone else into her battle. She didn't need allies. She just needed to prove herself. Later that evening, Leah sat at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. Her father, Henry Daniels, eyed her from across the table. How was your first day? He asked, his deep voice filled with genuine interest. It was okay, Leah said, not meeting his gaze. She didn't want to worry him. He was already under enough pressure as the new principal. Just a lot of new faces and trying to adjust. Henry smiled warmly. I'm sure you'll settle in. Just take your time. You've got this. Leah forced a smile. Yeah, I know. But inside, her frustration simmered. She didn't want to burden her father with the details of Miss Harding's coldness or the way her ideas had been dismissed. He had worked too hard to get where he was, and she couldn't afford to let him down. Thanks, Dad, Leah said, standing up to clear the table. I'll be fine. As she walked to her room that night, Leah's thoughts churned. Tomorrow, she told herself, she'd try again. She would prove to Miss Harding that she belonged. The next day in Miss Harding's class, Leah came prepared. She'd spent hours the night before reading and rereading To Kill a Mockingbird, eager to contribute meaningfully to the class discussion. Today's focus was on the trial of Tom Robinson, and Leah had carefully crafted her analysis on the racial dynamics at play. Miss Harding stood at the front of the room, her sharp voice cutting through the murmur of students. Today, we'll continue our discussion of the trial scene. Can anyone tell me what Harper Lee was trying to convey through Atticus Finch's defense? Leah's hand shot up almost instinctively, her heart racing with the hope that this time, Miss Harding wouldn't ignore her. But Miss Harding barely glanced her way. Yes, Marcus, she said, calling on a boy seated in the front row. Leah's hand slowly lowered as Marcus gave a surface-level answer, something about morality and justice. Miss Harding nodded approvingly. Yes, very good. Harper Lee wanted us to see the inherent goodness in Atticus's character. His defense of Tom Robinson represents the fight for justice. Leah bit her lip, her frustration growing. How could they gloss over the blatant racism in the trial? It was clear as day that Tom Robinson was convicted because of the color of his skin, but no one seemed willing to address it. When Miss Harding opened the floor for more comments, Leah raised her hand again. This time, Miss Harding paused, her eyes narrowing as she finally acknowledged Leah. Yes, Leah? Leah took a deep breath, her voice steady but firm. I think the trial shows how the legal system itself is biased. It's not just about individual morality, but about the way racism is embedded in the system. Atticus tries his best, but Miss Harding interrupted with a sigh. Leah, you're overcomplicating the matter. This novel is about human decency, not political commentary. Let's stick to the themes Harper Lee intended. The class went silent, all eyes on Leah. She felt a rush of heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her gaze steady. But the racial injustice is a core part of the story, Leah said, her voice quieter now. Ignoring it overlooks why the trial even happens. Miss Harding's expression hardened. That's enough, Leah. Let's move on. She turned back to the board without giving Leah a second glance. Leah sank back into her chair, her chest tight with humiliation. She had tried to stand her ground, but once again, Miss Harding had silenced her. Across the room, Oliver glanced at her, his face filled with sympathy, but he said nothing. As the days passed, Miss Harding seemed to zero in on Leah, finding fault in everything she did. Leah couldn't escape her critical eye. During class, Miss Harding would nitpick her every move, whether it was the way she sat or the way she wrote her notes. Leah, sit up straight. This isn't a casual space. Miss Harding would bark in front of the class, even though other students slouched just as much. When Leah handed in her homework, Miss Harding scrutinized it, marking it up with more red ink than any of the others. Your handwriting is sloppy, she'd say. You need to take more care in presenting your work. Leah kept her head down, focusing on her studies, but the unfair treatment gnawed at her. It wasn't just the minor critiques. It was the way Miss Harding would give her condescending looks or dismiss her contributions as misguided. The other students began to notice. Some looked at Leah with pity, while others smirked, feeding off Miss Harding's authority. Leah's isolation deepened with each passing day. One afternoon, Miss Harding announced a group project for the class. They would be divided into groups of 4 to analyze different aspects of To Kill a Mockingbird. I'll be assigning the groups, Miss Harding said with a tight smile. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place. Leah knew instantly that her group assignment would be deliberate. When Miss Harding read out the names, Leah found herself grouped with 2 girls, Sarah and Emily, and a boy named Carter, students who had shown little interest in speaking with her before. When they gathered to discuss the project, the tension was immediate. Sarah and Emily exchanged glances, barely acknowledging Leah's presence. So, I guess we'll divide up the sections, Sarah said, ignoring Leah completely. Emily and I can handle the themes of morality and justice. Carter, you can do the symbolism. What about me? Leah asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Emily gave her a quick, dismissive look. You can handle the introduction or something. Just make sure it's done by Friday. Leah's chest tightened, but she nodded. It was clear they didn't want her input. She'd have to prove herself through the work. Later that day, Leah stayed late at the library, poring over her notes and textbooks. She was determined to excel in the group project, even if her group members didn't respect her. The library was quiet, and Leah found solace in the silence. As she worked, she couldn't help but think of the unfairness she was enduring. Miss Harding's subtle racism, her classmates' dismissal, it all weighed on her heavily. Her thoughts drifted to her father. Should she tell him? But she couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him. He had worked so hard to become the new principal at Greenville, and the last thing she wanted was to appear weak. Leah shook off the thoughts and refocused on her work. She'd show them through her actions, she decided. She didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. The next day, during lunch, Oliver approached Leah at her locker. He shuffled nervously, hands in his pockets, but there was a look of determination in his eyes. Hey, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I just wanted to say I noticed what Miss Harding's been doing. Leah blinked, caught off guard by his words. What do you mean? Oliver scratched the back of his neck. The way she's treating you, it's not right. She's singling you out, and I should have said something earlier. Leah frowned, unsure of how to respond. It's okay. I don't want you to get involved. I'm handling it. Oliver shook his head. No, it's not okay. It's racist, Leah. The way she talks to you, ignores you. I've seen it. And I should have spoken up in class when she dismissed you. Leah's eyes softened. She appreciated his words, but the weight of her situation still felt like hers to carry alone. Thanks, Oliver. But it's not your responsibility. Oliver hesitated, his guilt evident. Maybe, but I want to help. If there's anything I can do. Leah nodded, offering a small smile. I'll let you know. As Oliver walked away, Leah felt a glimmer of hope. He saw what was happening, but even with his support, she knew that the battle ahead would be hers to fight. Leah walked into Ms. Harding's class with her head held high, though her stomach churned with anxiety. Today was the group presentation, and she knew Ms. Harding would be watching her every move. Leah had worked late into the night perfecting her analysis of the racial injustice themes in To Kill a Mockingbird, determined to do her best. The other groups went before hers, presenting basic interpretations of the book's themes of morality, justice, and human decency. Leah's group was the last to go, and she could feel Miss Harding's gaze locked on her. When it was finally her turn to speak, Leah stepped to the front of the class. Her heart raced, but she took a steadying breath and began her presentation. I focused on the trial of Tom Robinson, Leah said, her voice calm but strong. Harper Lee uses this trial to highlight the deep-rooted racial injustice in Maycomb. It's not just about individual morality. It's about a legal system that's designed to oppress people of color. Ms. Harding's eyes narrowed, and Leah knew what was coming. She pressed on, undeterred. The trial shows how racism isn't just about people's attitudes, but how institutions, like the court system, can be used to enforce inequality. Before Leah could continue, Miss Harding interrupted, her tone sharp. Leah, I think you're missing the point. This novel is about the struggle for human decency. It's not a political statement. Leah froze for a moment, feeling the weight of the classroom's silence. The other students watched, some looking down uncomfortably, others curious to see how Leah would respond. Leah swallowed her nerves and squared her shoulders. I'm not saying it's just a political statement, she replied, her voice measured. But the racial injustice in the trial is central to the story. Ignoring that overlooks a key part of the novel's message. Miss Harding's lips tightened into a thin line. That's your interpretation, but it's misguided. Harper Lee was writing about universal themes, not pushing a modern political agenda. Leah's cheeks burned, but she refused to back down. But the racism in the novel is part of that universal theme. It's about how society treats people based on their race, and how that impacts justice. The class remained silent, the tension thick in the air. Miss Harding stared at Leah for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she gave a curt nod. Let's move on, Miss Harding said, turning to the next group without another word. Leah returned to her seat, her hands shaking slightly. She had stood her ground, but the sting of public dismissal still lingered. She felt the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others curious. Oliver, sitting a few rows away, gave her a small nod of encouragement. That evening, Leah sat at the dinner table, poking at her food. Her father, Henry Daniels, noticed her quiet demeanor and set down his fork. Leah, is everything okay? He asked, his voice soft but concerned. Leah hesitated, unsure of how to tell him about the confrontation with Miss Harding. She didn't want him to worry, but the frustration of the day was too much to keep bottled up. I had a rough day in class, Leah admitted, keeping her eyes on her plate. Miss Harding. She dismissed what I said again. I was trying to talk about the racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird, and she kept cutting me off. Henry's face darkened slightly, though he kept his tone calm. Dismissed you how? She said I was pushing a political agenda, Leah said, frustration creeping into her voice. But I was just talking about the racism in the book. It's a big part of the story, but she acted like it didn't matter. Henry sighed, leaning back in his chair. Leah, I've been hearing things about Miss Harding. You're not the first student to feel dismissed by her. Leah looked up, surprised. Really? Yes. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions, Henry said. I wanted to believe it was just a difference in teaching style. But if this is how she's treating you, I'll have to look into it more closely. Leah shook her head quickly. No, Dad, don't. I can handle it. I don't want you to step in and make things worse. Henry frowned. Leah, if she's treating you unfairly, I have to address it. Leah felt the weight of his words, but she wasn't ready to let him fight this battle for her. I know, but let me try to deal with it first. I don't want people thinking I'm just running to the principal every time something happens. Henry studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but if it gets worse, you need to tell me. Leah smiled faintly. I will. Thanks, Dad. The next day at school, Leah found herself at her locker, going through her books for the next class. Oliver approached her, looking hesitant but determined. Hey, Leah, he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I saw what happened yesterday in class. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Leah raised an eyebrow, surprised. Sorry? For what? For not speaking up, Oliver admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. I saw how Miss Harding treated you, and I should have said something. It wasn't right. Leah gave a small, appreciative smile. It's okay, Oliver. It's not your fight. No, it is, Oliver said, his voice firmer. What she's doing, it's wrong. And if people like me don't say anything, it's just going to keep happening. Leah looked at him, her heart warming at his words. Thanks, Oliver. I appreciate it. But I don't know if it'll make a difference. It might, Oliver replied. If more people see what's going on, maybe they'll speak up too. Leah nodded slowly, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe. As Oliver walked away, Leah felt a sense of comfort knowing that she wasn't completely alone. But despite his support, the looming parent-teacher conference weighed heavily on her mind. Ms. Harding had already requested it, and Leah knew the confrontation could either make things better or much worse. Later that week, Ms. Harding approached Leah at the end of class, her expression as stern as ever. "Leah, I've scheduled a parent-teacher conference for next week," Ms. Harding said, her voice tight. "We need to address some concerns about your participation in class." Leah's heart sank, but she kept her face neutral. "What concerns?" Ms. Harding's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your behavior has been disruptive. You've been focusing too much on issues that detract from the curriculum, and it's affecting the classroom dynamic." Leah clenched her jaw but forced herself to stay calm. "I'm just sharing my perspective. Isn't that what we're supposed to do in class discussions?" Ms. Harding's eyes narrowed. "There's a difference between contributing and derailing the conversation, Leah. I suggest you reflect on that before the conference." Leah nodded stiffly, her mind racing. As she walked out of the classroom, the weight of what was coming settled over her. She knew this conference could be a turning point, but she had no idea just how explosive it would become. Leah sat quietly in her father's office, staring at the polished mahogany desk in front of her. The familiar space felt unnervingly foreign today. Her father, Henry Daniels, sat beside her, his face calm but focused as they waited for Ms. Harding to arrive. Leah's heart raced with anxiety. She had been dreading this moment ever since Ms. Harding announced the parent-teacher conference, fearing the worst. The door creaked open, and Ms. Harding stepped inside. She wore her usual expression, a mixture of superiority and disinterest, as she greeted Henry with a thin smile. "Mr. Daniels, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today." Henry nodded. "Of course, Ms. Harding. Let's get started." Ms. Harding sat across from them, folding her hands neatly on the desk. Leah braced herself as her teacher began. "I've asked to meet today to address some concerns about Leah's performance in class," Ms. Harding began, her voice cool and measured. "While Leah is clearly intelligent, I've noticed a pattern of behavior that I believe is disruptive to the learning environment." Leah's stomach tightened. She could feel her father glancing at her, but she kept her gaze forward, waiting for Ms. Harding to continue. "She has frequently focused on, shall we say, issues that detract from the curriculum. I understand that Leah has strong opinions, but her insistence on making certain topics, such as race, central to our discussions has caused unnecessary tension in the classroom." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Tension? Could you elaborate on that?" Ms. Harding pursed her lips, as if considering her words carefully. "Leah has a tendency to frame her contributions in a way that shifts the discussion away from the text. For example, she insists on focusing on the racial aspects of To Kill a Mockingbird, which, while relevant, is not the central theme I wish to explore with my students. I'm concerned that her approach is making other students uncomfortable." Henry leaned forward slightly, his tone still calm but with a hint of steel behind it. "Ms. Harding, from what I've heard from Leah, she's addressing very relevant themes in the novel. Race and injustice are pivotal to Kill a Mockingbird. Would you say her contributions are factually incorrect or merely a different perspective?" Ms. Harding's expression stiffened. "It's not that her contributions are incorrect, Mr. Daniels, but they're not aligned with the curriculum I've developed. I believe it's important for students to focus on the broader human condition rather than personal or modern political viewpoints." Leah felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but her father beat her to it. "With all due respect, Ms. Harding, To Kill a Mockingbird is a novel that directly addresses racial injustice. It seems to me that Leah is engaging critically with the text, not pushing an agenda." Ms. Harding's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice even. "I understand your point, Mr. Daniels, but I must maintain control over the classroom dynamic. Leah's focus on race, while valid in some contexts, detracts from the lessons I'm trying to teach." Henry sat back in his chair, his gaze sharpening. "Ms. Harding, I find it interesting that you're framing this as Leah's issue alone. Are you suggesting that discussions about race are inherently disruptive?" Ms. Harding blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. I wouldn't say that, exactly, but I believe that it can be a distraction when overemphasized. Especially when the rest of the class is focused on other themes. Leah could feel the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing second. Miss Harding seemed to be digging herself deeper into a hole, oblivious to the real problem at hand. And what, exactly, makes you think that Leah's perspective is overemphasizing these themes? Henry asked, his voice steady. Miss Harding shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Well, given her background, it's understandable that she would feel particularly drawn to these issues. But Leah's breath caught in her throat. Her background? Henry's eyes flashed. Her background? Miss Harding's face paled, realizing her mistake. I just meant that it's natural for her to focus on certain topics, given where she comes from. There was a heavy pause. Leah watched as her father's expression shifted, his calm demeanor hardening into something more resolute. Miss Harding, Henry said, his voice dangerously calm, I don't think you're aware of Leah's background at all. Allow me to clarify something for you. Leah is my daughter. Miss Harding's eyes widened in shock. She glanced between Leah and Henry, her face growing paler by the second. I had no idea, she stammered, her voice suddenly shaky. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as Miss Harding struggled to compose herself. Mr. Daniels, I didn't mean to imply. You didn't mean to imply what? Henry interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made Miss Harding flinch. That Leah's insights into racial issues are somehow less valid because of who she is? Miss Harding opened her mouth, then closed it again, at a loss for words. Leah sat frozen in her chair, the reality of the situation crashing down around her. Her father, the principal, was finally seeing the bias she had been facing. But at what cost? Henry turned to Leah, his expression softening. Leah, do you want to say anything? Leah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Miss Harding, she began, her voice quiet but firm. I've been trying to engage with the material in a way that reflects its full complexity. Racism is part of the book's central themes. Ignoring that feels like ignoring the truth of the story. Miss Harding looked down at her hands, her usually composed demeanor faltering. I see now that I may have misunderstood your intentions, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they left the office, Leah felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Her father walked beside her, silent for a few moments before speaking. I'm sorry, Leah, Henry said, his voice heavy with regret. I should have been paying closer attention. Leah shook her head. It's not your fault, Dad. I didn't want to make things harder for you. I thought I could handle it, Henry sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. You shouldn't have had to handle it alone. Miss Harding will face consequences for her behavior. I'll make sure of that. But more importantly, I want you to know that you did the right thing by standing your ground. Leah smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt truly seen and supported. Thanks, Dad, she said softly. As they walked down the hallway, Leah couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something bigger. A confrontation not just with Miss Harding, but with the entire system that had allowed prejudice to go unchecked for so long. And Leah was ready to face it. The hallways of Greenville Academy buzzed with whispers the day after the parent-teacher conference. It hadn't taken long for the news to spread. Leah's father, the principal, had confronted Miss Harding about her treatment of his daughter. Students exchanged glances as Leah walked through the halls, and though no one spoke to her directly, she could feel their eyes following her. As she entered Miss Harding's English class, the tension in the room was palpable. Miss Harding stood at the front, her posture stiff, her normally cold expression even more rigid than usual. She didn't acknowledge Leah when she walked in, nor did she meet the eyes of the other students. Good morning, Miss Harding said, her voice clipped as she began the lesson. But something in her tone had changed. It lacked its usual authority. Leah glanced around the room. Some students, like Oliver, looked at Miss Harding with quiet skepticism, as if waiting for something to happen. Others, like Sarah and Emily, seemed to be watching with a mix of curiosity and fear. Everyone knew something was different today. As Miss Harding moved through the lesson, there was an undercurrent of restlessness in the classroom. Whispers exchanged behind hands. Glances shot across the room. Miss Harding, for the first time Leah could remember, seemed unsure of herself. After class, as Leah packed her books into her bag, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Oliver standing behind her, his expression apologetic. "Leah, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Leah nodded, slinging her bag over her shoulder and walking with him out into the hallway. They found a quiet corner near the lockers, away from the crowd. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Oliver said, his voice low but sincere. "I should have spoken up sooner. I saw how Miss Harding was treating you, and I didn't do anything." "That wasn't right." Leah looked at him, surprised by his admission. "It's okay, Oliver. I didn't expect you to get involved." "No, it's not okay," Oliver insisted, his brow furrowed. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that alone. I was just afraid, I guess. Afraid of being targeted too." Leah nodded slowly, understanding his hesitation. "I get it, but it's not your responsibility to fix things." Oliver shook his head. "Maybe not, but it still feels wrong to stay quiet. From now on, I want to stand by you. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." Leah gave him a small smile, appreciating his words. "Thanks, Oliver. That means a lot." As they walked back to class, Leah couldn't help but feel a sense of validation. The silence that had surrounded her for so long was finally breaking. But she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to bring about real change. Later that day, during lunch, Oliver approached Leah again, this time with more determination in his step. They sat together in the courtyard, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees around them. "I've been thinking," Oliver said, his voice firm. "We need to do something. Miss Harding might be under investigation, but that doesn't fix the bigger problem." Leah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Oliver leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "It's not just about Miss Harding. There's a lot of people at this school who feel the same way she does. They just hide it better. If we don't do something, this will keep happening. To you, to me, to anyone who doesn't fit their mold." Leah felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. Oliver was right. She had been so focused on her own battle with Miss Harding that she hadn't stopped to think about the wider implications. "What do you want to do?" Leah asked, her voice steady. "We could start by talking to the administration," Oliver suggested. "There are other students who have probably dealt with the same thing. If we bring it to light, maybe the school will finally take action." Leah considered his words carefully. She knew that going to the administration would be a risk. There was no guarantee they would listen, and she wasn't sure how much power her father would have to change the school's ingrained culture. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the chance to make a difference. "All right," Leah said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." The next day, Miss Harding's class had an eerie sense of finality to it. As Leah entered the classroom, she could sense the unease among the students. Miss Harding stood at the front, but her usual commanding presence was gone. Her posture was stiff, her gaze fixed on the lesson plan in front of her, as though she was avoiding eye contact with everyone. Leah sat down at her desk, exchanging a glance with Oliver, who nodded at her in quiet support. Miss Harding cleared her throat, starting the lesson on a monotonous note. "Today, we'll be discussing the symbolism of the mockingbird in the novel. Can anyone explain what the mockingbird represents?" A few students raised their hands hesitantly, but the usual energy of the classroom was absent. It was as if everyone knew that this was more than just a regular lesson. Leah raised her hand, not because she particularly wanted to contribute, but because she felt compelled to reclaim her voice. After all, she had spent weeks being silenced in this very classroom. "Yes, Leah?" Miss Harding asked, her tone lacking its usual sharpness. "The mockingbird represents innocence," Leah said confidently, "but it also symbolizes those who are vulnerable to the prejudices of society. Tom Robinson, for example, is like the mockingbird. He's innocent, but he's destroyed by the racism that permeates the town." Miss Harding didn't interrupt this time. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if resigned to Leah's point. "That's a valid interpretation." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that Leah had ever received from her teacher. The class continued in the same subdued manner, and as the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Miss Harding dismissed the students with a half-hearted wave. As Leah walked out of the room, she felt a sense of closure. Ms. Harding's reign of silence and dismissal was coming to an end, but Leah knew that this was only the beginning of a larger fight. With Ms. Harding's influence waning, Leah felt a newfound sense of confidence in herself. She no longer hesitated to raise her hand in class discussions, no longer second-guessed her ideas, or kept quiet when she had something to say. In the days that followed, other students began to approach her, not just Oliver, but others who had noticed what she had been through and wanted to show their support. Some apologized for staying silent, while others offered to help in any way they could. Leah felt a shift in the atmosphere around her. It wasn't just about Ms. Harding anymore. It was about challenging the entire system that allowed people like her to be marginalized. One afternoon, as Leah sat in the school's courtyard with Oliver, they discussed their next steps. "I think we should start a group," Leah said, her voice thoughtful. "A place where students can talk about these issues. We can't be the only ones dealing with this." Oliver nodded. "That's a great idea. If we can get enough people involved, maybe we can push for real change at Greenville." Leah smiled, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time since she had arrived at Greenville Academy, she felt like she had found her place, not as an outsider, but as a leader. And with the support of people like Oliver, she knew she could make a difference. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Leah stood up, ready for her next class. She no longer felt the weight of Ms. Harding's judgment or the pressure to stay silent. Leah Daniels was ready to speak up, and this time, she wouldn't be silenced. The news spread quickly. Ms. Harding had officially resigned. Leah could hardly believe it when she overheard two students whispering in the hallway about it. Ms. Harding's departure felt surreal after all the weeks of tension. As Leah walked through the halls of Greenville Academy, the atmosphere was different. There was a noticeable absence of the oppressive weight that had once filled Ms. Harding's class. During lunch, Leah and Oliver sat together, still processing the change. "Can you believe it?" Oliver asked, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Ms. Harding's really gone." Leah nodded, her thoughts still swirling. "I didn't think it would happen. I mean, I knew things couldn't go on like they were, but she deserved it," Oliver said firmly. "What she did to you, and probably to a lot of other students, it wasn't right. She needed to go." Leah felt a mix of emotions. While she was relieved that Ms. Harding's reign had come to an end, there was still a lingering sense of unease. Change didn't come easily, and she knew this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed Ms. Harding's departure, the school administration, led by Henry Daniels, began making changes. Diversity training sessions were implemented for both teachers and students. Discussions about inclusion, equity, and systemic biases became a central part of the school's new direction. One afternoon, Leah and Oliver sat in the school courtyard, watching as a group of students gathered for a newly formed cultural awareness club. Leah had been asked to help lead the initiative, a role she accepted with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "It's weird, isn't it?" Oliver mused, watching the students walk by. "All of this happened so fast." Leah nodded. "It feels like everything's shifting. It's a good thing, but it's a lot." "Yeah," Oliver agreed. "But you're part of the reason it's changing. You stood up when no one else did." Leah looked down, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't think I was doing anything that big. I was just tired of being ignored." Oliver smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Leah felt a sense of pride, but also responsibility. The changes happening at Greenville were important, but she knew they wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, and not everyone would embrace the new direction the school was taking. But for the first time, Leah felt like she had the power to make a difference. The next day, Leah found herself in a meeting with the new Student Inclusion Committee, sitting at the head of the table with Oliver by her side. The committee had been formed to address the growing need for a more inclusive and welcoming environment at Greenville Academy, and Leah had been chosen as one of the student leaders. As part of this initiative, Leah began, addressing the group of students, "We want to create a space where everyone feels heard. That means opening up conversations about race, gender, and any other issues that have been ignored for too long." The students nodded, some eagerly, others with uncertainty. Leah understood their hesitation. Greenville had been a school of tradition and quiet prejudice for so long that breaking down those barriers wasn't going to happen overnight. One student raised their hand. "What if people don't want to talk about these things?" What if they think we're making too big of a deal out of it? Leah took a deep breath, knowing this question would come up sooner or later. It's not about making anyone uncomfortable, she explained. It's about creating a space where we can talk openly and learn from each other. If we don't address these issues, nothing will ever change. Oliver chimed in. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding where we've been and where we need to go. We're not here to point fingers. We're here to make this a better place for everyone. The room seemed to relax a little at Oliver's words, and Leah felt a sense of relief. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to lead. Leah's new English teacher, Mr. Thompson, had a completely different approach than Ms. Harding. From the moment he stepped into the classroom, it was clear that this would be a space where all voices were welcome. We're going to discuss literature in a way that allows everyone's perspectives to be heard, Mr. Thompson announced on the first day. There's no one right way to interpret a story. There are only different perspectives. Leah sat in her seat, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The tension that had once defined Ms. Harding's classroom was gone, replaced by a sense of openness and curiosity. When the discussion turned To Kill a Mockingbird once again, Leah raised her hand, feeling confident in a way she hadn't before. I think what's important to remember, Leah began, is that the novel isn't just about individual morality. It's about how systems of power can perpetuate injustice. Harper Lee was showing us that it's not enough for one person to be good. We have to change the system. Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. That's a great point, Leah. Let's dive deeper into that. The discussion flowed freely, with students contributing their thoughts without fear of being shut down. Leah felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in Miss Harding's class. She was finally able to express herself fully, and it felt like a new beginning. That evening, Leah and her father sat together at the kitchen table, the warmth of their home providing a sense of comfort after the long day. Henry Daniels looked at his daughter with pride in his eyes. You've come a long way, Leah, he said, his voice soft but full of emotion. I'm so proud of how you handled everything. Leah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You always believed in me, even when I wasn't sure of myself. Henry shook his head. You had it in you all along. You just needed the chance to show it. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of the past few months settling around them. Leah knew that the battle wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt truly equipped to face them. It wasn't just about me, though, Leah said quietly. It was about standing up for everyone who feels like they don't belong. Greenville's changing, but there's still a long way to go. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right, but you've started something important, and I know you're going to keep pushing for that change. Leah smiled, feeling a sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And now, as she looked toward the future, she knew that her strength and resilience would carry her through whatever came next. As they finished dinner, Leah glanced out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and pink. It felt like the perfect metaphor for where she was in her life, a new beginning, full of promise and hope.